Welcome, viewers. Today we explore a harsh battlefield where a young king defied impossible odds. In 1700, 40,000 Russian troops besieged the isolated Narva fortress. Against this massive juggernaut stands a freezing Swedish force of 10,000 men in a fierce storm. By all rules of war, this tiny, exhausted army is marching straight into a devastating fate. How did the fierce winter blizzard help 10,000 starving men crush 40,000 Russian soldiers? Historical records state that winter in the year 1700 was exceptionally brutal. The Great Northern War had just begun, plunging the entire Baltic region into absolute chaos. Tsar Peter the Great of Russia sought to expand his vast empire toward the freezing Baltic Sea. To achieve this ambitious goal, he marched his massive army to the Swedish fortress of Narva. The Russian forces numbered around 40,000 men, bringing heavy siege cannons to the walls. They quickly surrounded the stone fortress, trapping the small Swedish garrison completely inside. The situation seemed incredibly hopeless for the defenders, as heavy bombardments began daily. But news of the siege quickly reached the ears of the young Swedish king, Charles XII of Sweden. Only 18 years old, Charles was already a fierce warrior who demanded absolute discipline. Without hesitation, the young monarch gathered a small relief force of roughly 10,000 men. They began a grueling march across the frozen wastelands to save their besieged brothers in arms. According to military historians, this winter march was a horrific test of human endurance. Freezing winds lashed at their faces as soldiers trudged through deep snow and thick, freezing mud. Supplies were desperately low, leaving the troops starving, exhausted, and incredibly vulnerable. Every single step toward Narva drained the precious energy of the Swedish Caroleans greatly. Yet King Charles rode at the front, his stern blue eyes completely unfazed by the terrifying cold. His unwavering presence inspired the starving soldiers to push beyond their physical limits. Meanwhile, the Russian siege camp outside Narva was a sprawling city of tents and heavy cannons. Tsar Peter felt completely confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority and strong defenses. He had established a massive line of earthworks and deep trenches to protect his besieging troops. This fortified wall of dirt and sharp wooden spikes stretched for miles across the freezing landscape. Any attacking army would have to cross an open, muddy field under heavy Russian artillery fire. It was a textbook defensive position, designed to vanquish any foolish assault with total ease. To make matters worse, the Swedish army was completely cut off from any potential reinforcements. They were isolated in a hostile, freezing land, facing an enemy 4 times their actual size. Even the most brilliant military minds of Europe believed that Charles was marching to his ruin. How could a starving, exhausted force of 10,000 breach such formidable earthen defenses? The sheer scale of the Russian camp was intimidating enough to break the morale of normal men. Thick smoke from thousands of campfires darkened the freezing sky above the mighty Narva fortress. The thunderous roar of Russian cannons echoing across the valley served as a constant warning. It was a seemingly impossible challenge, a true perilous mission for the teenage warrior king. But Charles XII did not operate on normal logic. He believed in bold, aggressive strikes. He knew that hesitation in this freezing wasteland would mean certain ruin for his starving army. Therefore, he decided to launch a direct assault against the fortified Russian lines immediately. To understand Narva, we must first dispel a major historical misconception entirely. Many people wrongly assume that the Russian army in 1700 was merely a peasant mob. They picture a disorganized, cowardly horde of farmers holding pitchforks and rusty old weapons. However, historical records state that Tsar Peter had aggressively modernized his growing forces. He had spent years studying Western European military tactics and advanced modern artillery. The Tsar actively recruited experienced mercenary officers from across Europe to train his soldiers. These veteran commanders brought strict discipline and modern warfare strategies to the Russian ranks. The Russian infantry was equipped with standard flintlock muskets and sharp bayonets, just like Sweden. Their artillery division was incredibly powerful, featuring dozens of heavy bronze siege cannons. Furthermore, the defensive earthworks they constructed at Narva were a brilliant engineering feat. The deep trenches and tall mud walls provided excellent cover against incoming enemy musket fire. From a tactical standpoint, the Russian position was impregnable to direct frontal attacks. The Swedish troops possessed no magical weapons. They relied on the exact same gunpowder technology. Their only real advantage was their legendary discipline and the aggressive shock tactic called Gapa. But shock tactics require soldiers to run through open fields while dodging heavy enemy bullets. Doing so against a fortified enemy outnumbering you 4-1 is practically impossible. The European officers commanding the Russian lines felt incredibly secure behind their strong walls. They looked out at the exhausted Swedish lines and saw only a desperate, foolish teenage commander. They confidently adjusted their cannons, preparing to blast the approaching Caroleans into pieces. As the two armies faced each other across the frozen mud, the Swedish situation looked very bleak. Hunger gnawed at the bellies of the Swedish soldiers, their uniforms torn and soaked in freezing mud. They had not eaten a proper meal in days, and the bitter cold was slowly draining their very lives. Yet they stood in perfect formation, their faces pale, but their eyes burning with intense devotion. This unbreakable discipline was the true core of the Carolean army, forged through endless drills. Imagine standing in their freezing boots, facing an overwhelming enemy force. Would you still march forward? Charles XII rode along the front lines, his mere presence silencing the roaring winter winds. He knew that the Russian cannons could easily tear massive holes through his tightly packed infantry. If the sky remained clear, the Russian artillery would decimate them before they reached the wall. The Swedish generals nervously checked the skies, praying for a miracle to shield their vulnerable men. Nature was about to intervene in one of the most dramatic twists in recorded military history. Around noon on November 30th, the gray sky suddenly darkened with heavy, ominous storm clouds. The freezing temperature plummeted even further, turning the muddy battlefield into solid, hard ice. A terrifying, howling wind began to sweep across the plains, carrying sharp, biting ice particles. The Russian soldiers shivered behind their dirt walls, pulling their heavy fur coats tightly around them. The European mercenaries cursed the bitter northern weather, struggling to keep their cannons dry. No sane commander would dare launch a massive infantry assault in the middle of a brutal snowstorm. But Charles was not a normal commander. He was a brilliant tactician who saw hidden opportunities. As the blizzard intensified, completely blinding both sides, the young king noticed a crucial detail. The fierce gale-force wind was blowing from the Swedish backs directly into the faces of the Russians. The thick, swirling snow created an impenetrable white wall, effectively blinding the Russian gunners. Charles instantly realized that this violent weather was the ultimate shield his starving army needed. The heavy snow blew directly into the Russian soldiers' eyes, making them completely blind. Charles drew his shining sword and ordered his freezing troops to advance without making a single sound. They fixed their sharp steel bayonets and marched silently into the roaring, unforgiving storm. The thick blizzard swallowed the Swedish army, hiding their desperate movement from the enemy. Russian artillery officers could see absolutely nothing but swirling white snow in front of them. The deafening howl of the icy wind covered the heavy footsteps of the approaching Swedish men. Imagine walking toward doom, trusting only the king and the violent weather to hide your advance. The Caroleans moved like hunting wolves, their blue coats slowly turning entirely white with frost. They crossed the freezing mud and muddy trenches without the Russian cannons firing a single shot. It was a masterclass in exploiting natural advantages to completely neutralize overwhelming numbers. The young king marched alongside his brave infantry, enduring the exact same horrific cold as them. This shared suffering forged an unbreakable bond between Charles and his fiercely loyal royal troops. The Russian defenders remained huddled in their trenches, completely unaware of the approaching doom. They tightly gripped their heavy, wet muskets, trying desperately to stay warm in the brutal, freezing gale. European mercenaries complained about the terrible weather, assuming the Swedes were also resting.
Move those cannons now!
No rational military mind would attack during such a blinding, chaotic, and freezing winter storm. But Charles understood that surprise was his only weapon against a force 4 times his actual size. The Swedish line continued to creep forward, step by silent step, through the frozen, muddy wasteland. They reached the outer edges of the Russian defense line, still hidden by the intense driving snow. The tension in the air was thick, as the Caroleans prepared to execute their famous shock tactics. The tactic demanded absolute silence until they were close enough to see the whites of enemy eyes. Only then would they fire a devastating volley before charging violently with drawn steel swords. By the time the Russian sentries finally spotted the attackers, the Swedish forces were 30 paces away. Blue coats and sharp bayonets suddenly burst out of the swirling snow like vengeful, freezing ghosts. A massive roar erupted from 10,000 Swedish throats as they raised their heavy, loaded muskets. A thunderous volley of musket fire instantly tore through the terrified and unprepared Russian lines. Before the smoke could clear, the Caroleans threw themselves violently onto the wooden spikes and walls. It was brutal, close-quarters combat, a deadly dance of sharp bayonets and heavy golden rapiers. Charles leapt into the trenches, swinging his shining sword with the fury of a seasoned warrior. The Russian soldiers, blinded by the wind and shocked by the sudden assault, panicked completely. Their European officers screamed frantic orders, but the roaring storm drowned out their desperate voices. Wet gunpowder prevented many Russian muskets from firing, leaving them totally defenseless to the attack. The Swedish shock troops brutally pushed forward, breaking the formidable earthworks into scattered fragments. A massive wave of sheer terror swept through the Russian ranks as the devastation quickly intensified. Tens of thousands of men dropped their weapons and fled toward the fragile pontoon bridge behind them. The retreat quickly turned into a disastrous stampede, with men trampling each other in the deep mud. The freezing Narva River offered no mercy to the terrified soldiers trying to cross the narrow span. Under the immense weight of thousands of fleeing men, the wooden bridge violently snapped and collapsed. Thousands of Russian soldiers plunged into the freezing waters, perishing beneath their heavy, wet coats. The once mighty besieging army was entirely shattered, their camp overrun by the relentless Swedes. The fierce winter storm that Tsar Peter thought was an annoyance became his army's deadly undoing. By nightfall, the impossible victory was complete. The tiny Swedish force had broken the giant empire. Over 10,000 Russians perished in the deep, while countless others surrendered in absolute shame. In stark contrast, the Swedish casualties were shockingly low, numbering just under 700 men. Charles XII stood victorious amidst the crimson snow, earning the title Meteor of the North. His brilliant use of the weather and unbreakable discipline completely rewrote the rules of military tactics. This staggering defeat served as a devastating, harsh lesson for the ambitious Tsar Peter the Great. It forced him to completely rebuild and rigorously train his broken army for future devastating wars. The Battle of Narva proved that absolute numbers mean nothing without true courage and strict discipline. Nature itself had seemingly fought alongside the young king, granting him a truly miraculous triumph. The frozen landscape was littered with abandoned cannons, torn banners, and freezing discarded muskets. Surviving Swedish soldiers gathered around warm campfires, finally resting their exhausted and hungry bodies. They had marched into certain doom and emerged as absolute legends of early 18th century warfare. The myth of the invincible Russian juggernaut was temporarily shattered by a bold 18-year-old. News of this epic victory shocked all of Europe, cementing Sweden as a terrifying military superpower. Foreign generals studied his aggressive shock tactics, marveling at the insane bravery of his Caroleans. Yet, this incredible victory would also sow the dark seeds for Charles XII's eventual downfall. Convinced of his total invincibility, he would later march deep into the unforgiving Russian heartland. But on this freezing day at Narva, he was truly the undisputed and glorious master of the battlefield. The young king wiped the crimson stains from his sword, his cold blue eyes scanning the distant horizon. His legend was forged in the freezing ice and brutal mud, a story of unmatched tactical brilliance. The Siege of Narva remains a powerful reminder of how nature and human will can conquer sheer numbers. When all logical hope is completely lost, bold action and discipline can create unbelievable miracles. History rarely witnesses such a dramatic and overwhelming victory won by such a small, starving army. The terrifying Swedish war machine had proudly announced its arrival to a completely stunned modern world. The roaring blizzard had finally stopped, leaving a chilling silence over the broken Russian fortress. A new, tragic chapter of the Great Northern War had officially begun upon the icy banks of Narva. Charles's reckless charge brought victory, but fueled a lifelong war. Was he a genius or a madman? Did his aggression doom the Swedish Empire in the end? Or was it the only way to truly survive? If you enjoyed this historic journey, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content.